Olaf Scholz is addressing the press after meeting with China's president and prime minister. Let's listen in.
Calm and careful, honest talks and discussed all issues regarding the bilateral relations between Germany and China, Europe and China. We also addressed questions of global development, and in doing so, we have managed to develop topics that we have already discussed here in public. An essential topic is the question of how to continue along the lines of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. It's a terrible war that is fought with cruelty on behalf of Russia, and it is important for Germany, as well as all the other friends of Ukraine, to keep supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. And at the same time, our diplomatic endeavors, for which Ukraine stands to, will be continued. An example are talks in Copenhagen, Jeddah, Davos, and conversations that are planned for the future. Here we have set a sign to continue this, and the conversations receive support. I believe that this is necessary progress because, apart from the military support of Ukraine on behalf of Germany and its friends and allies, it is also about the question of diplomacy, and this is what we currently focus on. At the same time, we discussed the question of the war that started with the terrible attack of Hamas on Israel. We have exchanged our points of views and discussed what is required here. Germany has a clear stance. We want to achieve a ceasefire. We want the hostages to be released, and this has to happen swiftly, and this is also a topic that we have discussed. Of course, there are questions of economic relations. This is what we also focused on, and this is about topics that have to be precise, where we have to be pragmatic, because you can't beat about the bush when it comes to, for example, a level playing field for German companies in China. I believe that we have seen positive developments, and the economic delegation was able to ask all the questions that need to be addressed urgently from their point of view, and I have met a pragmatic environment, which is also a sign. For me, it is very important to make clear that this war cannot simply be continued by Putin the way it began. There is no cause, no reason to justify this war, which is why it is so terrible to see how cruel this war is still being fought. Our support for Ukraine is very clear. I am firmly convinced that the negotiations that we have led here are a building block that will make a contribution to our discussing the questions that we have to move forward on diplomatic terms. As I've said before, the conversations we've had so far were important and valuable in Copenhagen, Davos, and now it is about taking further steps. And I believe that many citizens in our country understand that it is important to have not only military support, but a diplomatic process that we have to develop, and it has been important and very positive to raise this here.
Herr Bundeskanzler, Sie haben vor dem Gespräch gesagt, dass Sie das Thema der
before the talks, you have said that you would like to raise the topic of dual use with Xi. After the conversation, do you have the feeling that something happened here, that you have made progress, and that there is a willingness in China to change the attitude? I've already said that this is a topic that we have not raised. And of course, that comes with the question that you have asked here. For me, it is important to make clear that there is an urgent need not to supply Russia with arms, but of course, the dual-use question also belongs to that question. It has been possible to raise all the necessary issues here in a way that cannot be misunderstood. I would like to ask once again, so do you have the feeling that you have made progress? Because that was one of the aims of Germany, to at least reduce the export of dual-use goods, and on behalf of China, Iran has not been mentioned explicitly. Could you maybe say a few words about the points that you raised in your discussion? The topic of dual use has been discussed at length by us, so there cannot be any misunderstandings as to how we see things, and I am convinced that this is important. The question regarding the attack of Iran on Israel, well, for me, it is obvious because it was an unprecedented attack that is completely unjustified, an unprecedented escalation that gives rise to concern, and now it is about everybody contributing to not increasing this escalation anymore. And I have made clear that it's not only about the Israeli forces, but a broad understanding in the region that this is not acceptable, and I am convinced that this has been taken on board.
Nicole Johnston from Sky News. Do you agree with the EU and US position that China is dumping cheap green technology products on the global market?
It is obvious that there is a need to discuss the issue of overcapacities, that we have to discuss subsidy races, which is an essential topic because the question of subsidies can be found all over the world. Many nations choose to do that when it comes to new and green technologies or advanced technologies of electromobility. This is why it is so important to establish processes that make sure that not everybody can develop this as they like. The World Trade Organization is a very positive organization that we have discussed here too, where usually you have to file subsidies and then they are negotiated along this process. And I believe that this is necessary progress that needs to be made. I also have a question regarding the economic relations and the business dialogue. You have praised China. Could you maybe be a little bit more precise regarding the fields in which developments were made? We have discussed many individual cases, issues such as copyright, intellectual property, question regarding access to public tenders, or issues connected to different details put forward by German companies themselves. So it's a very long list, and it is important that we be very pragmatic when discussing these questions. My hope is that this will swiftly be translated into concrete facts. The ideal competition model of global trade is for everybody to compete without unfair trade practices in individual countries, while keeping everybody in a position where they can prevail on all the markets. And that's a key factor of the German industry, that small and medium-sized enterprises can produce competitive products in Germany, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. world, which is why they are so competitive. For me, it was important to see that many things that used to be abstract actually exist in a hands-on, in a tangible way. Many things have progressed, especially in China and its economic development. There are cities that are very, very large, where many modern buildings have been erected, cities with millions of inhabitants, larger than what we have in Europe. And I think this is what we have to bear in the backs of our minds when talking about China. But irrespective of its size, there are regions that lag behind in economic terms in China, but then there are areas that belong to the fields that can compete on a global scale and have developed in a very modern way.
It's Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz there addressing the press after his meeting with the President and Prime Minister of China. He spoke about calm and careful talks marked by pragmatism. Let's break it all down with DW's Chief International Editor, Richard Walker, who joins me in the studio. Main takeaway?
Yeah, OK, Nicole, we didn't learn a whole lot during that Q&A, I have to admit. I mean, he was pretty vague on a lot of subjects. And I guess, like, we can talk about a couple of different clusters, yeah? I mean, talking about Ukraine, first of all, you know, he went to China hoping to get the Chinese to crack down on the supplies of what are called dual-use goods. So these kind of, not necessarily weapons to Russia, but sort of components or technologies or, you know, the kind of supplies that could help in their war effort, at least indirectly. And we just heard him being asked there about, you know, did you get, you know, a kind of a promise from the Chinese that they're going to crack down on this, and of course we got a pretty vague answer to that. There were a couple of other areas that there was focus on with respect to Ukraine. One was a peace conference that's due to happen this summer in Switzerland. You know, there was definitely hope on the German side, I think, that Xi Jinping would say, okay, China will take part in this peace conference. This is the third in a series of peace conferences. The first one, the Chinese sent a delegate. The second one, they didn't send a delegate. Now the hope is that, well, let's get them to send a delegate. All they've basically come up with is they agree to stay in touch on this and consult on this, like what would this peace conference look like? And I think the main bone of contention is that when you look at what the Chinese are saying about their talks, the Chinese are saying, you got to invite Russia, which has not been present at those peace conferences so far. So we'll have to watch, like in the next few weeks, whether that becomes a realistic possibility that Russia could join that, or whether that becomes, you know, a real sticking point. So, and the third item, which we didn't hear addressed so much there, but that there had been focus on, the last time Scholz went to China, he extracted language from the Chinese speaking out against threats or the use of nuclear weapons with respect to the Ukraine conflict. This time around, it's interesting to say that Scholz said, yeah, we got a reaffirmation of that. But if you look at what the Chinese statement said, they don't actually mention this question of threats of nuclear weapons. They just mentioned the use of nuclear weapons. Yeah. So they seem to have actually watered that down. So, like, where we can say, bottom line, is there progress here? There's not that much to hold on to, but what Scholz is partly saying there is like, okay, we've got discussions going about negotiations, about potential peace processes, and he is sort of saying that, okay, we've got one track of supporting Ukraine militarily, but we also have to look at this other track of trying to get the Chinese more involved in finding peace.
We only have about a minute before we go off air, but, you know, China is Germany's biggest trading partner. Any progress there? Yeah,
well, the word that we heard from Olaf Scholz there was pragmatism. Let's deal with these issues pragmatically. And I think the question will be going around in a lot of people's minds, okay, what does that mean? And particularly in Europe. So the European Commission is doing some investigations into whether China is unfairly dumping kind of cheap electric vehicles and all sorts of green technology into global markets in Europe and other markets, and whether they need to start kind of taking action against that. Scholz talking about pragmatism. Some people might think, OK, does that mean that he feels that what's going on in Europe is motivated by something other than pragmatism? We don't know yet. Again, we're going to have to read between the lines.
I'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. And we'll be back after a short break. Hope to see you then.